welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, and welcome to Turn the Page podcast. I'm Catherine, your friendly neighborhood reference librarian, and today I am excited to talk to a debut author who has written quite a spectacular Gothic horror story. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Linda Hamilton. I am debut author of The Fourth Wife. I live in Southern California, and I am also a history grad student working on my master's right now, and a mom of four crazy little kids.
Well, that's a full-time job in and of itself. But
Yeah,
what are you getting your master's in?
I'm getting it in history. Right now, I'm working on my thesis, and my thesis is actually on Mormon women in polygamy in the 19th century and identity.
So you are an expert on this topic then. So I feel like we are in very good hands. Um, for those who don't know, The Fourth Wife is coming out March 31st. And this was described to me as a gothic Mormon horror, aptly so. Do you want to give a brief summary of the book just so that people
Absolutely.
know what we're getting into?
The Fourth Wife is a historical Gothic horror set in 1882 Utah about a Mormon polygamous family that lives in a haunted house.
So I went into this book with very little knowledge on the Mormon religion. You know, I have my bits and pieces that you catch from pop culture and media and, history books, but I really went into this kind of blind. So it was very informative to me reading through this and seeing what their belief system is and how they operated at that point in time in terms of how they treated different aspects of their society. Our main character is Hazel, who is a young woman, and she doesn't have a lot of agency just because of her standing in life and her age and, other factors going on for her. What inspired you to write Hazel's story?
So I was born and raised Mormon. I've always been a huge history nerd. And so I grew up on stories of Mormon history and pioneers and Utah and polygamists. I am descended from several polygamous lines, as is my husband, as is pretty much most Mormons you may know. If they have been in the church for generations, they've probably come from polygamy. And so I was really interested in writing a book about polygamy. I originally wanted to write like like a traditional historical fiction. And I was interested in kind of exploring my own ancestors' story. And so I went and started doing some research onto one of my ancestors. And I discovered that I have this third time great grandfather who married a woman and then 3 years later married that woman's biological sister.
Wow.
And so this was actually, I just, at first I was like, what the heck is happening? But I discovered through research that this was actually pretty normal in Mormon polygamy. Same with mother-daughter pairs. There was a lot of belief that if you married somebody who was already related to someone else, that they might get along better. I don't think that was actually true in practice. It was probably worse, in my guess, but there definitely were a lot of people who married within the same family over and over again. And so I was really interested to know what life could have been like for these women. And so I started doing a lot of research into polygamy and into history, doing just like deep dives into documents and into like books written by historians. And I very quickly realized that the story of polygamy I had been taught as a kid was very whitewashed, very, very inaccurate. It was very male centric. And it really was just like, well, it was hard, but they were faithful and it was all great. And I discovered that polygamy was actually a nightmare in many ways. There were so many issues that were just not talked about in my childhood. And so as I was developing this story and wanting to write, about this character I named Hazel, I discovered that I'm like, this book is not, it's historical, yes, but it's a horror. It is a gothic horror. And I was motivated to write it as a gothic because I wanted to have, there's like ghosts and spooky things and this crumbling mansion and all these unknowns, but all of those mirror the actual reality of the horror of patriarchy and this oppressive system where, as you said, Hazel has so little agency of her own.
Yes. And I have to say, you nailed that classic Gothic vibe. The beginning of the story takes place while Hazel is still with her family. She's living with her mother and her aunt and her siblings, hoping for the possibility of marrying this boy that she has loved from her childhood. And that does not work out. And she ends up marrying Jacob. So the beginning is kind of a broader exploration of the Mormon society as a broad generalization, which I learned a lot from being a person who had really no background in the subject. Uh, but then once she's married and once they start heading out towards the house, as soon as the house is brought into the picture, I got like chills because it's described as this grand manor, this huge, beautiful house, or what was once a huge, beautiful house that was proud and uh, out in the middle of nature. And then you start getting the details of it's slowly being taken over by nature. It's falling into disrepair. It is um, dusty and broken and not quite right. And it's not just the house, but the surrounding land that the house is on immediately paints you a picture of something isn't right here. So the house itself fantastic. Then you get in the house and you're like, somehow it seems bigger on the inside almost, where you're like, there's rooms you didn't know that were there before. How many children are in the picture, and somehow you don't meet them until quite a bit later on, to the point where I was like, I don't know if these children are here. I don't know if these are real children or if these are ghost children, because I haven't seen a single one in this house. But that alone is really good. And honestly, I got vibes of The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. And it made me wonder, like, did you have any like influences for how you wrote the romance aspects, the horror aspects? What influenced your creation of this story?
So I am a huge Gothic girly. I love Gothic books, Jane Eyre, like kind of one of the OGs. Mexican Gothic was definitely like a hugely influential. And I just love all of those really classic tropes. And so I stuck with a lot of those classic tropes because I felt like, okay, so we have all these different Gothic tastes. Gothic's kind of starting to get a renewal right now. And I was just thinking, we've this book Mexican Gothic just came out and it's so good and it's such an interesting take on like here's a classic Gothic and now we're going to set it in Mexico and I was like there's no Mormon Gothic. Like so I wanted to be able to kind of expand the genre into this kind of specific era and this specific um culture and religion that has hidden horrors within it. So definitely like a lot of those classic Gothics really influenced me to write this book and to use a lot of those classic Gothic tropes on purpose, not because I wanted to place them within this culture and this religion and this really unique place like Salt Lake City. Why is there going to be a Gothic in Salt Lake City? I also really, really love like these kind of like messy relationships that are there in the book between the sister wives.
Mhm.
And so I was, it sounds weird, but I was kind of inspired by a lot, like Mormonism's having a lot of a pop culture moment, right? We have things like the Sister Wives show. Now we have Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, which wasn't out when I wrote this book, but it has this similar dynamic of across the Mormon spectrum, you have these messy relationships being displayed in pop culture, specifically about Mormon women. And I think that there are some, one of the things that maybe pop culture sometimes misses is that deep at the root of these interesting relationships, that are going on in like Real Housewives of Salt Lake, for instance, is this overwhelming patriarchy foundation and how it informs the way these women speak to each other and talk to each other and live their lives. And so I kind of wanted to bring that to light in a little bit of my own way of like, there are these women living in this house and they have these complicated relationships with each other and with their husbands and with, the church and all everything around them. And the one thread that's running through all of it is this patriarchal control.
To bring up the wives, obviously, you can't avoid them. They are in such an isolated setting. The wives are main characters as much as Hazel is. And when we're introduced to the wives, first of all, Jacob introduces Hazel into this family the day that they are married and did not give them any prior warning. So, what a way to meet your new housemate.
Yes.
While I was like reading it, I was making a list of like all of my red and green flags because I was like, it's just interested, I like to plot things out while I'm like reading. So like it was stupid, but my first red flag was Jacob likes licorice. I'm like, that behavior is evil in and of itself. Red flag right there. It gets much worse than him liking licorice. But like that was like three red flags for me. I was like, he didn't tell the other wives that he was bringing Hazel. So not only are they bamboozled that a stranger being brought into their house, but Hazel was also under the impression that the other wives knew about her. What a rough meeting.
Yeah. So I did that on purpose. I mean, aside from like the creepiness and just the horror of that in itself, it's actually historical, because in theory, within Mormon polygamy, as it's laid out in the scriptures, the Mormon scriptures, is that the husband has to get the permission of his other wives in order to take a new wife. They often refer to this as the law of Sarah, and it's still practiced in theory in fundamentalist Mormon religions that still do polygamy today. However, the scripture also says that if she doesn't give you permission, she will be destroyed. So the idea of consent for Mormon women to gain more wives and more sister wives is pretty much nothing. It's like, okay, consent or be destroyed. And what happened a lot of times was that men would just marry. They would just marry someone else and wouldn't tell their other wives. And then it was just like, oh, here we have now. We have Sister Sarah. She's here in the marriage now. And so I wanted to highlight that was a thing that happened. The idea of a woman's consent is not as consensual as it may sound that it should be. And I purposely set up all the wives so that they would kind of represent a different like belief around polygamy. Because while my book does take a strong stance of like, this is an oppressive system at its root, polygamy was a wide spectrum, right? You had people who did legitimately love living polygamy, and you had people who absolutely hated it, and then you have a whole mess in between. And so, even though my book, had to kind of pick a lane, right, and stick with the lane, I wanted to make sure that I kind of gave some nods to other thoughts. So, one of the wives, for instance, is a feminist, which is something that a lot of people are like, what is happening? There were suffragist women in Utah in the 1880s, and absolutely there was a pretty strong a feminist suffragist movement within Utah and within polygamous wives specifically, which is a very fascinating topic in itself. I wanted another wife to be kind of this like long suffering, very faithful to the point that she is angry and she is going to white knuckle everybody into eternity with her kind of wife. And then we have another wife who's just completely checked out. She's like, she just peaced out. I'm over this. I'm over everything. And she basically lives for just trying to annoy the heck out of her husband.
She does a good job.
Yes.
She does do a good job in annoying her husband, but she kind of toes a line that plays into what you just said. A lot of what a Mormon woman had to deal with was consent or be destroyed. And it was a theme that I was like, I caught it a little bit in the beginning, but the further and further you get into it, the more apparent that message is. Hazel marrying Jacob, not her first choice. She had a boy that she loved and hoped that she would marry one day. So tying herself as she does to Jacob is a whole nother level of commitment than a different type of marriage. They are marrying themselves in this life and in the next life. And it's kind of thrown in her face quite a bit that she has to do as he bids, as, he's her husband, or else she's going to burn for eternity. And like that's a second source of horror that I wasn't anticipating. You're not only having to deal with the gothic nature of the house, but you're also dealing with kind of an underlying horror of the religion itself. It's fear through faith or faith through fear, perhaps. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to delve into, that, the religion itself, as it's depicted in the book, is quite scary.
Oh, yes. That was kind of one of the things I really wanted to explore, is because the actual theology of 19th century Mormon polygamy is quite terrifying when you break it down. And I think a lot of for instance, just referencing my own childhood understanding of what polygamy was and why people did it, because the modern day Mormon church, the mainstream church, doesn't practice polygamy anymore, was just very surface level. And it was all just like, it seemed fine. It seemed like it was weird, but it was fine. And then when you actually dig into the theology, like Brigham Young, these early leaders saying that women cannot be saved unless they are married to a man. Like, you must be married to be saved. And so there's so many levels of like, how do you actually say I made a choice here? When it's like, okay, so I can do this thing that sounds pretty horrible, but God wants me to do it, or I can like go to hell. Like, what, how do you deal with that? And I think that is one of the horrors that I explore, especially towards the end of the book, is that bringing out this idea that it's not just that you're married to this man. It's that the belief, this deep-seated belief that in the next life, you are also married to this man. And it's not just that you're married to him and you're with him. Mormon theology teaches that he is going to become a god, a literal god, and you are going to be his wife, servant, priestess, queen kind of person, along with all the other sister wives populating his planets. Like, it's a pretty horrifying future when you really break down and think about it.
Yeah, no, horrifying is putting it lightly. And again, it's this secondary source of horror that I wasn't anticipating. And it amplifies the position that Hazel is in because the longer she's there, the more her relationship with Jacob dissolves. In the beginning, when she first meets him, before they've actually married, not that there's much time between meeting him and getting married, he's quite sweet with her. She suffers from anxiety and panic attacks. She, throughout her life, and it continues into this book, she has what seems to be a panic attack in front of him, and she's afraid that he is going to reject her. And he ends up comforting her and telling her that she's okay. And she views him as, she calls him an anchor in a storm, which like is such beautiful imagery. And then you get further into the story, and you're reminded that an anchor can also drag you down and drown you if you're stuck in it. She's really stuck between a rock and a hard place because as her relationship with Jacob is dissolving, um, he is kind of showing his true colors. Even if she wanted to leave, even if she thought she could, she's now risking like eternal damnation in the eyes of the church. And that's just such a tough position to be put in. And the way you wrote it was just really emphasized like how stressful and how horrible it would be to be stuck in her shoes. So,
Yeah. I really wanted to, talk about abuse. There's all sorts of different kinds of abuse, but that is a very common thing that happens in abusive relationships is, before the relationship's official, before you're married, the man is so nice. He's the best. He love bombs you. Like you just can't imagine that anything horrible could happen. And then the next thing you know, once you're like tied to him, suddenly that's when those true colors come out and that abusive situation happens. And to outsiders, it's like, well, why didn't you just pick a better person? And you're like, I picked an amazing person. And he was not who I thought he was. And that is a huge theme for Hazel as the book goes on, is her realizing like slowly, layer by layer, all these things that she thought about him were all lies. And they're just kind of slowly peeling back and away. And as you said, even when she sort of realizes like, I'm not in a situation I want to be in, what options do I have here? None. I'm in the middle of nowhere in this marriage, this polygamous marriage that's for eternity. I don't know how to break it. I don't know how to get out. I don't even know how to get back to town.
yeah, she's unable to get out of it. And then just, she's so isolated, physically isolated, in terms of where their house is, like the homestead is so far out from and away from town because they're trying to avoid being detected. She is kind of isolated for the most part from the other wives. She does have, budding relationships with them, but it seems that she keeps making the wrong choice or they keep clashing, and it's none of their fault. It's just three strangers thrown into a house together and told to make it work. It's so isolating and so lonely. And then as if that wasn't enough, you find out, oh, ghosts.
Yeah.
Which, I didn't realize this was going to be a ghost story, or I didn't realize that there were ghosts in it. And the way that you write is very descriptive. It really got under my skin in a lot of different ways, which excellent work. You did exactly what you set out to do, and you did it really well. But you gave like imagery of someone breathing on the back of her neck, which I just got chills thinking about breathing on the back of my neck. And I literally wrote in my notes, all capital letters, ghost question mark. I didn't know this was an option.
It gets worse.
Funny enough, this terrible situation does in fact get worse.
Yes.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed playing with the themes of isolation and claustrophobia because they're both kind of happening simultaneously. You have these themes of isolation, right? They're physically isolated. She's isolated from the other women. She's isolated from everyone in her life. She's isolated from understanding her own self. And then at the same time, it's claustrophobic. She's trapped in this house with this family of people she doesn't really know. Um, and then you throw this like ghost on top of it. And I was very specific, and I think those who were raised in Mormonism or are familiar with it will probably pick up on a few Easter eggs because I tried to make this spirit entity very Mormon, as weird as that sounds, because there are actual, like, there is lore in 19th century Mormonism about spirit beings and things that are still believed to this day. The foundation of the religion is actually very magical and very folk magic based. And, Joseph Smith, the founder, has a lot of stories about meeting spiritual beings and all of these interesting things. And so I just kind of wanted to throw some of those little tidbits in to make it like this is a very specific ghost that's speaking to her in her language in a specific way.
So everything packaged up together, the horror of being in a devolving abusive relationship, the horror of being stuck with strangers that you don't know, which as an introvert, that alone, you could have just written about that and I would have been like, this is horrific. The horror of damnation, the horror of ghosts. There's so much in this book for readers to unpack. And it was excellent. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. And I hope that you continue to explore uh, different aspects of horror and just different aspects of writing in the future, because I'd love to see more from you.
Oh, thank you. I'm really excited for my next project.
Do you have a next project?
I do. My next project comes out approximately a year from now.
Oh,
So it is a second book, also coming from Kensington, set in not the same world, not like it's not like a sequel, but it's kind of set in a similar Mormon history vein. But this one, I'm taking it back to the original, to the roots of Joseph Smith, this magical worldview. And this book has horror elements. It is not a necessarily, I wouldn't categorize it as a horror. It's more of like a speculative historical fiction. And it's much more witchy vibes. And it's
hmm.
about a woman who was a real woman by the name of Sally Chase and who was a seer in upstate New York in the 1820s who used magic stones to find buried treasure.
Okay.
And she actually taught Joseph Smith how to use said magic stones to find buried treasure, which then led to him finding the buried treasure of the gold plates, which led to the whole religion. So it's kind of about like what happens to women in history that are superseded by a man, that are buried in order to prop up a man's story. It's a really fun, much more like adventure forward book.
That sounds great. I am very much looking forward to reading it, and I hope I'll be able to talk to you about that book next year.
Yes, that'd be great.
So, as we wrap up this discussion, is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners?
I hope that readers across, across the United States, across wherever they read them, that they will feel parts of their own story in Hazel's story, even if you have not grown up in a fundamentalist religion or don't have any sort of affiliation with those kind of things, that you can still see within it this story of a woman finding her voice, overcoming, powers that want to make her into something that she is not. And I hope that that will inspire people.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Linda. And with that, it's time for us to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.